Colleagues, hi. Thanks for the opportunity to join your meeting today. My name is Hamish Coates. I'm a Professor of Higher Education at Tsinghua University in Beijing, and I have had some engagement with the field of student engagement for at least 20 plus years, and Siobhan's asked me to say a few words, so thanks very much, and look forward to sharing a very brief history of my involvement and some ideas along the way for how you can advance your work in the field. It all began for me with this report. It was a report that I actually got my first job at the University of Melbourne to do in about 1998, which was to take the current survey on student satisfaction for measuring these aspects of largely classroom-based teaching to instead focus as well on these aspects of what we were doing outside the classroom in higher education, developing aspects of the broader student experience, one might say. And my work in that field continued for about the next decade as I started to write the national reports. I'll say more about that later on, but it became clear to me that what students were doing in a narrow teaching and learning space was just a small slither of the full deal that we, and everyone expects from higher education. Those were formative insights, and what I realised then is that we needed to go a lot more to try and understand what students were doing in higher education. So I did my PhD in the topic, Student Engagement in Campus-Based Online Higher Education, and focused very directly on what was going on with students, how they were interacting with university, and most importantly, the informed role, and often accidental role, of digital learning platforms, which of course at that stage, around 2000, 2002, were what we would consider today to be in their infancy. Not all universities had a learning management system. Certainly we were still a long way away from students having ubiquitous smartphones, but they were using technology often in very bad ways to skip lectures and not engage with study and email lecturers at all hours of the day to mediate how they engaged in the university study. One of the most important things I think I did during that piece of work was turn the focus away from higher education institutions and student satisfaction with their service provision to focus instead on how students and different types of students and different styles of engagement were at play in higher education, and really made a huge difference in us understanding what was going on. Into a new environment after I worked for a brief time at an institution called the Graduate Careers Australia, I joined the Australian Council for Education Research and developed something came to be known as the Australasian Survey of Student Engagement. This is an example of the reports that we used to send to every university, as it ended up being after about 2 years. In Australia and New Zealand, we would prepare national reports, as I'm sure is still the case in Ireland, looking at trends amongst student groups, amongst different scales, and looking at how that sort of information could be used not just at the institutional level by university leaders and researchers, but most particularly by faculty across the institution. And we would run, very similar to what you're doing today, National Student Engagement Symposia, and just at the infancy, if you like, of running online teleconferences as they were during the day, very much pre-video conference, and trying to get conversations going about students' engagement in learning. That was a very rich and rewarding time in terms of not only my own involvement, but certainly the national engagement in student conversations about student engagement. There was all sorts of sort of nerdy technical developments we made, from the paper-based form through to the use of online surveying technologies. Quite controversial at the time, but inevitable trend, which of course now is just part of the way we do business. Most particularly, a lot of digging around in the data, this new form of data that we had in Australia and New Zealand, and mirroring that developed in the US, to try and bring out some new and interesting insights into different facets of university study, which quite frankly, no one had really been able to think about before because we just didn't have the data. Along with those research briefings, also developed a whole host of what I termed enhancement guides. These were very much guides based on targeting people in different roles, such as yours, but also different hot topics that would come across the higher education press or institutional concerns at the time. How to use the data, how to convert the data into practice, how to develop new roles. And it was around about this time, indeed, that institutions started to point people into something that previously hadn't been a role in an institution, that of student engagement director. So we started to see, if you like, the institutionalisation and the professionalisation of people's contribution and expertise and know-how in this field. Really important and really good sign of how student engagement data could be used in all facets of the institution. You know, it's something that's transboundary and crosses across so many different facets of higher education. Parents, students, aspirant students, and the like. It was a very deep and rewarding time, and we started to go even further and map and new insights across the different aspects of what we sometimes refer to as the student pathway or student journey. Back then was often referred to in a very washing machine like terminology called the student life cycle. So I put questions into the Aussie survey about when students first became aware of higher education, when they started to approach and engage with institutions, the nature of their involvement, and most particularly started to shift towards also measuring students' perceptions of their achieved outcomes. Now, there had been some history of that way back into the 70s and 80s in the US field of student surveying, but we knew very little about some of these outcomes outside of the United States higher education context. So we started to unlock new discourse, new conversation, new roles, new committees, new interventions, new funding streams around how institutions, governments, families and communities could involve students, not just in enrolling in higher education, but of course most particularly the sorts of day by day, moment by moment, micro forms of engagement that mean people are not just physically but also psychologically and emotionally existing in the studies in ways in which they hope they are. Very soon after that, we realised that there had been an enormous amount of work all around the world. So with Alex McCormick, who had just taken over running the NESI from George Koo, we did an international book on national, often sometimes provincial case studies of student engagement. And indeed, that's when I had started talking to colleagues in Ireland around about 2011, 12, and so on, about the survey that they were developing, which referenced, given the similarity of the systems in Australia and New Zealand and Ireland, the work that we had done. So very pleasing to see that it's still going strong and taking even more dimensions as the work grows. Around about the same time, while most of my work's in higher education, I got an invitation from the Australian government, given the success in that sector, to broaden the work and also look at how we could measure student engagement in vocational education and develop something that has become known as the National Quality Indicators, which involves surveys of students and of employers for the registered training organisations in Australia. And student engagement is one of those areas that's mentioned. It's not exclusively focused on student engagement, but the idea of how learners engage in vocational education became something that was talked about in that sector. And of course, pleasingly, we could then start to radically make comparisons between higher education and vocational education in this unique area of student engagement, and of course other areas that we measure. Around about the same time too, I also had the good fortune to be the International Project Director of the OECD's Hello study. And in that piece of work, in amongst the test instruments that we developed in engineering, economics and generic skills, we ran for faculty, students and institutions multi-level student engagement surveys. And we drew from, of course, not just the student survey of student engagement, but the faculty survey of student engagement that we had as well developed with our US partners in in Australia and run in a few universities there and in New Zealand. So we spanned out from working just in one country to working with a few countries bilaterally, like Ireland and the US and China and the like, to now working with quite a host of countries. And it was really pleasing to see the way sometimes the ideas around student engagement changed, sometimes they stayed the same, even regardless of very different higher education contexts. I mean, the way that someone visits a library in Cairo is quite similar to the way that someone might visit a library in Dublin, in Moscow, in Melbourne, in New York, etc., etc. So you can actually start to look at very basic sorts of learning interactions between students and teachers, between teachers. You know, the whole deal starts to become open to analysis. And that world, of course, gives people like me and colleagues around the world an opportunity to study what's going on in higher education, thereby areas we can use to, you know, cross-reference good practice and also target opportunities for improvement. And around about that time, be careful what you wish for, the Australian government realised that there was a fascinating and very powerful lens that could be used to understand, monitor and improve higher education sector, and they invited us through open public tender to develop something called the University Experience Survey, which is now known as the Student Experience Survey. And I developed that over a period of 2 years, which quite importantly enabled us the opportunity to step back from things that had been developing over 30 years and take stock of what really mattered and put forward a series of new conceptual frames for understanding how we include, support, teach, engage and develop the skills of people in higher education. We also made a number of technical improvements so that rather than us working with universities to collect the data, in fact, the universities gave me all of the student details from every student involved in the relevant populations at the time. And I did the survey for the first time, I think, ever in this country of Australia from my laptop. Not without its challenges, privacy laws, computer problems and all the rest of it, but we managed and thereby set in place the arrangements for this sort of data collection to become highly institutionalised. In fact, it's now done annually and reported along with the graduate destination survey data on the university websites and used for regulation by the national regulator and provided via the website that I'm showing you here on the internet for all to use, including you. It became very clear, however, that while we were looking at sort of student engagement with a sociological or a group-based lens, that fundamentally the way that we had been thinking about student engagement still only explained in statistical terms about 20% of the variation in what we could see, and very much was taking some pretty long-held views about higher education that weren't obviously part of the way we think about higher education. So in 2013-14 I proposed to the Australian government that we develop a new perspective on student success and understanding the student success of pathways, journeys, touch points and milestones that each individual student could have. And our capacity to do that, of course, was not just shaped by some sort of conceptual insight that we needed to go deeper to try and understand how to help each and every student who bothers to engage in higher education, and often those who don't know that they should, but instead the computing technologies that had enormous amounts of data. And leading beyond that, we started to see, and this book has just come out with a fantastic chapter by Siobhan and colleagues, how further international development has proceeded apace in the area. Where's it all going? Well, it's going ahead through conversations among people like you about how you can understand the data, understand the problems that you confront, and use your expertise and that source of evidence to solve some of those problems. Often data can stop the conversation that gets in the way of solutions in higher education. But more broadly, what we must do is look beyond how we think about student engagement to instead how we think about education engagement. And in the last chapter of the book, also I published in the Times Higher Education, we need to think about many new ideas for not just engaging students in higher education, but engaging higher education in the world. And I think in the last couple of years, with all of the volatility and change that we've seen, it's become quite obvious that universities and students aren't doing these deals by themselves. Education is very much part of the community, the society and the worlds in which it operates. And we need to start understanding that to help universities serve those communities even better. Just as we did in 99, 2000 to look outside the classroom, now we need to look outside the campus and think about how universities engage in the broader world. So much to discover, so much to advance. All of the resources that I've mentioned are available either online or if you want to get in touch, I can send you some specific resources or publications. And our main challenge, of course, is to get all of the problems of higher education solved by the end of your conference today. So I wish you all the best with that. Look forward to keeping in touch, and all being well, next time you come together, I'll have a chance to meet many of you in person. Thanks so much, and all the best.